What is anti-racism? My name is Dr Muna Abdi and I'm guiding you through an introduction to what anti-racism is. Before we take a look at what it means to be anti-racist and what that work actually entails, we're going to start off by looking at some key concepts that allow us to really understand the problem it is that we are trying to address. So we begin by thinking about this concept of race. What do we mean by race? Ta-Nehisi Coates refers to it as being the child of racism and not the father. And this is a really important quote because what it highlights for us is that the system of racism is what allows the socially constructed notion of race to exist. And race is ultimately just a system of categorization. People are positioned in particular categories based on this socially constructed notion of race. And the categorizations can take a number of forms. It may be based on their physical features or assumptions around particular physical features being associated with different races, connected to a place of origin, and it's ultimately about hierarchy and power. The hierarchies and the power distributions between different races and also within different races as they are constructed as well. It's a verb, so it's seen through the process of action, and it's historically and continually constructed. And then we come to racism. When race is used to create or reproduce hierarchical social structures based on racial categories, this is essentially what racism is. It's a system of advantage based on race. So as Ta-Nehisi Coates outlined in the quote, it is the child of racism and not the father. And racism exists regardless of intent, which means very often when we are thinking about racism, we think about it as something that is interpersonal, that is somebody acting on a particular prejudice, and that is one of the ways in which it can manifest. But racism does not rely on ill intention in order to exist. You can be a good person and uphold systems and structures that allow there to be advantage based on race or disadvantage based on race. So it's regardless of intent. There may be explicit and implicit forms of racism. We know that there are different types of colorblind racism, so the idea that everybody is treated the same, everybody is seen as the same, this notion of sameness and equality, as opposed to the equity that we need to be discussing. And there's absolutely the notion of a benevolent form of racism, the racism of good intentions, that I am not a racist, and we'll explore why that isn't equivalent to being anti-racist in a few moments. And then you come to this image that really outlines for us what we mean by systemic racism. So we've talked about what we mean by race and what we mean by racism, and the systemic nature of racism is about highlighting the ways in which it's multi-layered. So when we think about racism in the everyday sense, we think about it as the event that is happening, what we can see, what we can name, what we can identify as being racist. But this is the tip of the iceberg. What happens below the waterline is what really draws our attention when we're looking at systemic racism. So as well as seeing the things that are happening right in front of us, the events, it's important for us to be able to identify what those patterns of behaviour are, to start noticing those trends that are occurring over time. It's important for us to then dig deeply into looking at the structures that influence those patterns of behaviour and allow those trends to remain fixed. And then ultimately at the bottom of that iceberg, it's important to pay attention to the mental models, the ideologies, the values, the assumptions and the belief systems that shape the structures that we see and that shape the behaviours that are presented over time in the trends that we notice as well. And the more awareness and understanding we have of the systemic nature of these issues and what's happening below the waterline, the more we're able to increase our leverage as we do this work that we are calling anti-racism work. And so what is anti-racism? It is ultimately the act of disrupting racism. What does that mean? It is an active process. It's about identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizations, structures, policies, practices, and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. It's ultimately about identifying where racism is being enacted and doing the work of disrupting and challenging those processes in order to redistribute power. Remember that one of the key functions of racism is to uphold power and hierarchy. And so when we're doing anti-racism work, we are actively engaged in disrupting that. When a person is striving to become anti-racist, they seek to become aware of some of these key issues. How racism affects the lived experiences of people of colour, how racism is systemic, and how white people participate, often unknowingly, in racism. And it's really important to pay attention to those three key areas. And finally, to clarify some misconceptions, let's have a look at some of the things that anti-racism is not. So anti-racism is not racist. So Angela Davis really powerfully articulates this by saying the opposite of racist isn't non-racist, it is being anti-racist. So it's important for us to really consider what we mean by the distinction between the two. Anti-racism is not equivalent to being not racist. The opposite of racist isn't not racist. When we say I am not racist, what we're doing is focusing on the individual. The focus on who is and is not racist only serves us on an individual level. It is often just a focus on morals and values. And so when people say, I am not racist, that is usually followed by, I am not racist, I am a good person, or I am not racist, I have done such a thing in order to prove or justify that I am not racist. It is very individual. And in essence, what it is saying is that I can remove myself from a dynamic that is impacting people of colour in a negative way. As long as there is some other person who is racist, that I no longer have to think about, feel guilty, or do anything to dismantle the system. When we do anti-racism work, we acknowledge that racism isn't just held within the individual, it is institutional and it is systemic. And as individuals, we work within those systems and within those systems and within those institutions. And so we have a responsibility to dismantle and to challenge them. Anti-racism work is not diversity work. What do we mean by the distinction between the two? When we think about work that is done around diversity and work that is done around anti-racism, it's important to understand the distinction between the two. Diversity work is ultimately about recognizing difference, recognizing those who are marked as different and thinking about how we can bring them into the same space. Diversity ultimately is about managing race rather than addressing the issues of challenging racism. And so that is a clear distinction between what diversity work is and what anti-racism work is. Anti-racism addresses racism directly and it focuses on the cognitive aspect. It focuses on the ways in which we not only engage in racism through our practices and through our behaviours, but the ways in which we have been racialized to think in a particular way and to see the world in a particular way as well. So it's really challenging us on a very cognitive level as well. And anti-racism is firmly rooted in the notion of race and racial discrimination being systemic and embedded within policies and practices of institutional structures. So reminding ourselves of the iceberg, diversity work really focuses on what is at the tip of the iceberg, the events, the things that we can see, and how we can change things on a very surface level. Anti-racism acknowledges that these issues are systemic and they're embedded, and so it's about looking at the deeply rooted issues and challenging those at the very levels in which they are created. Because anti-racism is essentially a verb, it manifests through our actions, it manifests through the choices that we make. When we choose to be anti-racist, we become actively and consciously aware of race and racism, and we take action to end racial inequities in our daily lives. Being anti-racist is ultimately about believing that racism is something that is everybody's problem. It is a system that we are all navigating our way through, and that we all have a role to play in stopping it. And finally, a note to remind ourselves why we do this work and why we must do this work right now. To bring about change, we must not be afraid to take that first step. We will fail when we fail to try.